Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing, Thursday edition. My name is Brian Calley, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. Learn more about them at consumerscu.org. So, Brian, I feel like lately we have been playing a little bit of where in the world is Brian Calley, or where in the state of Michigan is Brian Calley. You've been reporting to us live from various locations. Where are you today?
On Mackinac Island, and unfortunately not here for a vacation, although if you're going to be working somewhere, it's a great place to work. I happen to be in the Mission Point Resort, which is a family-owned hotel. I love this hotel because you can bring your dog too, which is kind of special on the island. Most places don't let you bring your dog. But the Detroit Regional Chamber does a Mackinac Policy Conference where business leaders, philanthropic leaders, government leaders, education leaders from all over the state gather once a year. And it's kind of a gauntlet of events and meetings and contacts and media, but it's been kind of a tradition for SBAM to have a strong presence here, and this is no exception to that rule. So that's at the Grand Hotel where the conference is held. So I make the walk back and forth several times a day. But this year, it's not unusual for there to be policy proposals that are unveiled. And this year, I would say probably the most interesting and the thing that you might hear most about the conference is that the governor is proposing a commission to investigate and recommend ways to grow Michigan's population. You've really heard SBAM raising alarm bells on Michigan's population decline and the challenges that we have in front of us with growth, and how some shrinkage in our population is kind of built in over the next generation. It's going to be difficult for us to adjust to when we're already so short on workers. So the governor proposed a commission. At the top of that commission are a couple of well-known figures, and including John Ricolta, who's more from the Republican side of the political spectrum. So I think it's a nod toward, or an effort to make it more bipartisan. That commission has a broad, I would say, dramatically broad charge on investigating and making recommendations on population growth, but also like education and infrastructure issues as well. And those things all kind of tie together. It is a pretty broad charge for a commission. Sometimes when if things are too broad, then you get these high-level recommendations aren't necessarily actionable. Commissions typically are more effective if they have a narrow focus where you have some experts that are zeroed in on very specific things and then can inform the policymakers. In this case, it's really playing almost like a legislative body to investigate and consider broad issues. But of course, we can't criticize any kind of focus on population growth. It is Michigan's #1 challenge in the long term. It is the main thing that will hold us back in the future. We were the only state in the first decade of the century to shrink. We stopped the shrinkage and kind of grew a little bit through the next decade of the century, and then now we've started to shrink again. So this is the top and main thing that policymakers need to focus on. So pulling for them that they're able to develop some solid recommendations that are actionable and that can make it through the political process for those that require changes the way that the law is written. Final thing I'll say on that, though, is that it's hard sometimes not to get caught up in the like population shrinking. What do we need to do? Well, it's not what thing do we need to do or what 5 or 10 things that we need to do. To turn around population trends, it requires a lot of things that make incremental progress done consistently well over a long period of time. There are no quick fixes to it. It's the sort of thing where the first step to growing your population is to get it to stop shrinking. Then as you get it to, to a stable or level point, then to try to choose its growth. And in the meantime, though, you'll see us at SBAM really focused on how do we do the most with what and who we have today. And that is, it's just a practical point of view. But before you can attract people in, you got to be able to keep the people that you already have. And so I'm hopeful that that is looked at as job number one, is to keep the people that we have, to make this the type of place where more people from Michigan or in Michigan choose to stay in Michigan. And of course, that's the best advertisement for people to move in.
Absolutely. Let's switch gears and talk about what's happening in Washington, D.C. and the debt ceiling issue. The House has passed the compromise brokered between the president and the House Republican leadership. So what's that mean? What's happening now?
Yeah, this is the debt ceiling issue. It comes, you hear it come up time every once in a while, and it's really on a cycle of when the federal government hits the legal limit of debt that the country can take on. It is kind of a difference between, most countries don't have like a debt limit that has to be separately negotiated from the spending decisions that happen earlier. In this case, though, that debt limit, which is set at a little over $31 trillion, that I almost said billion there, which would have been. I'm from this little town called Portland. 31 billion seems like a lot of money to me, but in U.S. debt terms, it's $31 trillion. But as this debt ceiling is reached, the U.S. government is unable to pay for things, to expend money, if it means the country going into debt. Well, the country has been deficit spending for quite some time, and that's not going to change anytime soon. It's a matter of really that I think the realistic goals are first to slow the rate of the country going into debt, because most of it is for paying interest on the debt, but then also entitlement programs, mainly Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, which those are items that are kind of off the table, if you will, politically speaking, when it comes to these questions about debt. So it only becomes the separate issue with discretionary spending that is truly on the negotiating table. So in this case, they kind of took it to the brink. The U.S. Treasuries, so this is when U.S. government borrows money from its own citizens, from people around the country, from corporations, from other countries, whoever's buying those treasuries, that's considered a risk-free rate. In other words, the market considers the U.S. government owing somebody money to be risk-free. There's no chance of default. But the debt ceiling is hit and the government is unable to make interest payments on its debt, it would go into default. It therefore could not be considered anymore the risk-free investment option. That's something that a lot of other things are pegged to. So it would cause a lot of turmoil. The Republicans in the House saw it as an opportunity to negotiate leverage, to be used to negotiate some changes that they wanted to see happen. The president really did resist a negotiation for a long time, but eventually came to the table and they reached what we at SBAM considered to actually be a quite reasonable landing place. One that it was interesting to see yesterday as a vote happened, that the vote was pretty evenly split in terms of Republicans and Democrats who voted no, and Republicans and Democrats that voted yes. That it was one of the few, like truly, the opposition and the support both looked very bipartisan, and we don't really see that too often. So that really does put this issue of the debt ceiling, it pushes it off into the future until early 2025. And I think that was a lot of the people in the political system didn't want to deal with it before the next election. And so that's kind of where that date, January 2025, comes from. And so in the meantime, the question potential like turmoil and financial instability that would come from a U.S. debt default is off the table, if you will, at least until early 2025.
Just keep pushing those problems down the road, right? Let's talk a little bit about, what the compromise entails, and let's start with spending. What can we expect with federal spending now?
So I would describe this as restraining future growth, not cutting spending. When you hear somebody talk about cutting spending, I think the way they justify that is to say that it's that spending growth will be lower than inflation, and therefore that's like things have to be cut when your revenue grows, or when spending is restrained to an amount less than inflation would be driving up costs of things. So basically, they're going to hold spending to about last year's level on discretionary spending. So actually, let me put another qualifier in that. Non-military discretionary spending, because military spending is technically discretionary as well. So you have entitlement programs that of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those are just based on how many people, and there's formulas, and those expenses are what they are. The government will continue to make interest payments on its own debt. So all the rest of it would be discretionary spending. That will be limited this year to about what it was last year. And then the agreement is in future years, out 10 years, that the growth in those items would be limited to 1% per year. If you were the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan organization, very credible organization, says that the difference on current spending level and this new deal, 10 years from now, our deficit will be about 1.5 trillion less than it otherwise would have been. It's not to say 1.5 trillion less than it is today. It means it will grow 1.5 trillion less than it would have. So in other words, this is slowing the rate of going into debt is the final deal. And really it's if they are able to keep non-military discretionary spending below or at 1% or below, economic growth actually will create likely more revenue growth through tax revenue for the federal government, and therefore would potentially close that deficit a little more. But I guess we'll have to see.
And then what about the policy issues? I know, here at ASPAN, we actually issued a statement yesterday. We supported this compromise, partly because of the policy changes that they committed to. So talk a little bit about those.
If you've been watching this briefing, you know that when the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and it had $80 million in for expanding audit capacity of the IRS, that we had some concerns about that. And so one of the items that they're just going to kind of tap the brakes on some of the expansion within the IRS. Now, money's fungible within the government, so the IRS won't necessarily make big dramatic changes in what they were planning on doing anyway. But about $20 billion of the $80 billion that the IRS was receiving, that is being repurposed. So it'll support other types of spending, not in the IRS. Now, I have heard that the IRS might be able to take the other 60 million and do some of it earlier, and to avoid dramatic changes in their the plans that otherwise we're going to implement. But generally, a positive in the agreement is that the aggressiveness of the IRS, or the resources to dramatically increase their audit capacity, is restrained more than it was before. Another thing is, during a time of epic workforce shortages, we talked about with our population, for example, but also labor force participation rates are way down in Michigan at around 60%. There was an agreement to apply the work requirements to SNAP benefits, used to be called food stamps. So SNAP benefits for able-bodied men with no children. Okay, so that group of people that right now work requirements apply up to age 49. And so it's expanded now to it'll apply up to age 54. So they added 5 years of additional work requirements for SNAP eligibility. A modest change, but again, a nudge in the right direction. And so the other area is permitting of energy projects. This was the one that is probably the most substantive of the policy changes, and it puts like a shot clock on permitting decisions for energy projects and mining projects. So these are some pretty critical areas. Mining, because with this transition to electrification, it's going to require more mining, and yet it's really hard to get through the process. A lot of the bureaucracy slow walks these things. And but then also on energy projects as well, at a time we've seen sustained high energy prices, to establish explicit timelines for decisions on these really could help move things along as well. So those are the big policy issues that got negotiated in, and overall it passed the House fairly comfortably, and then heading to the Senate, where just because of the timeline that is required, the Senate needs to take it up without even considering amendments. So really, if June 5th is the default date, if you will, when the government needs to have this passed and signed, that doesn't leave any room for error here. So it goes from the House to the Senate in pretty strong position, where I do expect it'll pass.
All right, one more topic at the federal level, with the Federal Reserve. Are they sending any signals related to their June meeting?
Yeah, we've seen mixed signals on what to expect in their June meeting. This is when they would decide if they're going to increase interest rates or not. Remember, there's been lots of interest rate increases. Right after the last meeting, there was, I believe that they were trying to set an expectation that at the next meeting that they were going to pause. They're going to skip an increase in that meeting. They will not consider increasing it probably. There have been since then inflation numbers that were kind of iffy, higher than expected, and just stubbornly kind of stuck at the level they've been at for a little while. And so between that and just the overall jobs market and upward pressure on prices and limits in labor force, the market, there's predictive markets on this stuff, and it started to price in maybe there would be an increase in June. But in looking at some of the board, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, they seem to be kind of pushing back and reaffirming that no increase in interest rates in June. Now, if the jobs report for last month, which will be out before their next meeting, if that's blisteringly hot, I suppose that could, they would have to consider that because it is the labor market that's been pushing prices up. If that comes in where they expect it to come in, then I think we'll get a little bit of a reprieve here from further interest rate increases. Although while they were resetting expectations for the June meeting, I do believe that they intentionally left it wide open for increases after the June meeting. So they definitely want to see a period of time here, let things settle, let the monetary policies do their work, see how it goes out, and then decide later if you want to increase. And they seem they really did seem to intentionally and explicitly suggest that this pause does not mean we're done. It means we're going to wait and see and evaluate, and maybe there'll be more.
All right. Well, we'll keep you updated on that moving forward. So, Brian, let's switch to some state policy talk. SBAM has supported criminal justice reforms that are aimed at rehabilitation and getting people back in the workforce. Clearly, a big need there. But there's a new proposal that's a bit more controversial. Can you give us a rundown on what we're calling productivity credits?
Yeah, this actually showed up in the last term, and our Legislative Action Council did consider it. We looked at a whole series of criminal justice issues, decided not to support this particular aspect of it. And it is, it's one of these issues as a close political observer. I noticed that both our Attorney General, the left side of the political spectrum, and Republican leader in the House, Matt Hall, right side of the political spectrum, they both agree on opposition to productivity credits. And then there's a different, group of, again, very diverse group of people that support it. But this is the idea that a person gets sentenced, and then they go to prison. And while they're there, based on the things that they do, and everything from good behavior, what they used to call good time, but good behavior in prison, maybe additional training and classes and just other things, that you could get your sentence reduced below what the sentencing guidelines say. So every crime in Michigan has a range of sentencing guidelines, and prosecutors and judges have to stay within those guidelines. They can't find you guilty of a crime and then give you less time than the sentencing guidelines say. Passing this legislation would essentially be an exception to that, to say, hey, people might be sentenced according to those guidelines, but they could be released earlier than that if they have productivity credits that build up while they're in prison. For us, it did, we always have to look at a balance on these issues. And workforce is why we support so many criminal justice reforms: expungement when people stay out of prison, problem-solving courts, sobriety courts, a treatment-based approach when people are addicted and it led to a crime. All of those sorts of things that SBAM has supported in trying to get people truly rehabilitated back in the workforce. But it is also, we have to balance that with community safety as well. So crime levels in communities where our businesses operate are another important factor that we considered. And so while we didn't take active opposition to this policy, we also don't support it to pass good time or productivity credits as an exception to the productivity guidelines, with really a concern that there has been a lot of changes in criminal justice reform and a lot of positive things that have happened, but we do need to be careful that we don't unintentionally make our communities less safe where our businesses and families are living.
All right, now let's talk about community college. There's some new national numbers out that show community college enrollment is down nationally, but it's way down here in Michigan. So any clue as to why that's happening here?
Yeah, the overall enrollment in community college nationally was down about 0.5%. And in Michigan, it was down 2.2%. So it's more than 4 times higher decline, or quicker decline than nationally. If you go back though to 2019, so the year before the pandemic, enrollment in community colleges is 85% of what it was. Part of that is our demographics, our population getting older, the number of people graduating from high school, going into college, that pool of people, it's getting, so the pipeline is getting smaller. So it's not surprising that it shrunk, just like it did nationwide. But in Michigan, our population challenges are particularly acute, and therefore we saw a bigger decline. Now, the state is definitely focusing in on community college as a venue for getting people at a good value and lower cost from where they get out of high school to the type of job that can pay a living wage, and a person can participate more broadly in just the options out there in the economy. So I think that there's some signs with Reconnect, another policy change and investment that SBAM supported through the system, in fact, led on. I think there's reasons to believe that this population decline, once that's fully in place and people are utilizing this venue more, there's reason to expect that this dramatic decline that we've seen will slow and maybe stabilize. It is, one thing I'll mention though about community college, enrollment is one thing. So we're talking about enrollment here, but we need people to persist to completion as well. And there's an accountability system that was passed late last year at the end of the last legislative session that the governor signed, that we're hopeful that will not only see enrollment stabilize, but then also more people persist to completion.
All right, now let's talk about something happening in Detroit, where Mayor Duggan has proposed quite a big change for their property tax system. What's that look like?
Yeah, so the mayor, I've heard this idea floated around, excuse me, and I saw in the more than a year ago, this was being discussed in Detroit, but it was really put on the table in a pretty formal way for a change to essentially shift the property taxes less away from improvements and more to land. So there's a frustration among leaders in Detroit that there's a lot of land that speculators are just holding, and it's sitting there. It's not being put to work. It's depressing local communities because there's not development happening. It's suppressing government revenue growth because, again, this land is just sitting there in speculation. And so the idea, the way that Mayor Duggan laid it out, was that those who own homes or improved property would see a reduction, maybe upwards of 30% of their property taxes that they pay, but that would be shifted to proportionately more to land. So every property would be taxed more on land and less on improvement. So if you only own land and it's not improved, it's expensive just to sit on it, or it's expensive to turn it into just a surface parking lot, which there's a lot of that, especially downtown. That will prove to be somewhat controversial with people that own unimproved land or properties where the land is proportionately worth a lot more than the improvements on the land. But I would expect that from a local perspective, certainly politically, it makes a lot of sense that homeowners should be the voters. In the city would see a net reduction in their property taxes, and then speculators who more likely don't live in the city would see an increase. There's an old saying in politics that the best taxpayers are the ones who can't vote in your jurisdiction. Now, in this case, there are a couple of issues I'll be interested to see how they want to deal with. Our Constitution requires, first of all, that property is taxed on an ad valorem basis. In other words, it has to be taxed according to its value. So if you have one property that's improved and another property that has no improvements on it, just land, you have to treat them, you have to tax according to the actual market value of the property. For those who know a lot about property taxes out there, say, yeah, but there's property tax or taxable value and SEV. But when you set the SEV, which is ultimately what the taxable value resets at, it has to be based on the actual market value of the property. You're not just allowed to decide, well, we're going to say land's more and the improvements are less. So that's one obstacle to get around. It's not in legislation form, so I can't evaluate how they're dealing with that provision in our Constitution. The other thing is that there has to be uniformity. So our property tax system requires uniformity as well. Again, another constitutional principle. And so treating different types of properties different, I think it'll be a tricky legal balancing act to implement this sort of thing. But the idea of those who have made bigger investments, actually improved property or have improved property, proportionately paying less taxes, probably the sort of thing that there would be a lot of local support for.
All right. So Brian, in 2 weeks, it's SBAM's annual meeting, a small business summit. So in 2 weeks, it'll really be over and we will have celebrated a wonderful day. but we would love for our viewers to join us on June 15th in Lansing.
Yeah, this is SBAM's biggest event each year. It's our volunteer leadership, it's our membership, stakeholders, partner organizations that gather together, hundreds of people, usually around 500 people maybe. It's in the Lansing Center. It's right downtown, and there's express learning sessions. There's a trade show floor with a variety of different organizations, really cool stuff there. And then a main stage, there's a luncheon and a main stage. And McKeel Haggerty will be telling the origins story of the insurance company from the basement of the house to a publicly traded company, which we're really excited about. So yeah, I would just encourage people to come. Just be an opportunity for those of you who know us through the screen. We'd love to meet you in person. So please do come and say hello. And you don't have to tell me that I look shorter in person than I do on the screen. I already know.
And Brian's actually leading one of our express learning sessions on SBAM advocacy and action. So check out sbam.org/annual meeting for the full agenda, and please register. Have a great rest of your week, everyone. We will be back here Monday at 3 p.m.
See you next week.